The machine discovered in the basement of Edinburgh's Royal Infirmary during the late summer of 1881 was among the most disturbing devices medical science had ever encountered. This strange apparatus, resembling a medieval torture device crossed with Victorian medical equipment, was interwoven with copper wires, adorned with glass vials filled with mysterious fluids, and equipped with leather restraints designed to hold a human head perfectly still. But what terrified investigators most was the collection of 247 glass orbs, each one glowing with a faint inner light. Oscar Blackthorne, retired professor of medicine from Edinburgh University, wrote in his memoirs 40 years after that horrific discovery in 1921, "We descended into that basement thinking we would merely expose the crimes of one physician. What we encountered, however, was a discovery that challenged our fundamental understanding of the nature of the human mind." What Dr. Malcolm Sinclair had created was not simply a medical device. This was a method of capturing, storing and transferring human consciousness itself. Our story begins not with the discovery of the machine, but with the systematic disappearance of memories from the minds of Edinburgh's most vulnerable citizens. Margaret Campbell, a vibrant 34-year-old woman, had entered Dr. Sinclair's private clinic with perfect recollection of her life's experiences. She emerged unable to remember her own children's names, her wedding day, or even the taste of her mother's cooking. Yet Dr. Malcolm Sinclair had gained something far more valuable than any monetary payment. He now possessed her entire life experience, living vividly inside his own mind. The Scotland of 1881 was a nation caught between ancient traditions and modern scientific advancement. Edinburgh, with its towering castle and medieval old town, served as the intellectual heart of the Scottish Enlightenment's final flowering. The city's medical school had earned international recognition for its innovative approaches to treating mental disorders, and physicians from across Europe travelled to Scotland to study the latest developments in alienist medicine. Dr. Malcolm Sinclair had arrived in Edinburgh in the spring of 1876, carrying impeccable credentials from the University of Vienna and letters of recommendation from some of the most respected neurologists in Europe. At 38 years old, he possessed the perfect combination of youthful enthusiasm and mature expertise that made him immediately attractive to Edinburgh's medical establishment. His specialty, he claimed, was the treatment of memory disorders and traumatic amnesia, conditions that conventional medicine had barely begun to understand. Sinclair's appearance commanded immediate respect. Standing 6 feet tall with perfectly groomed auburn hair and penetrating green eyes, he moved through Edinburgh's social circles with the confidence of a man accustomed to being the most intelligent person in any room. His voice carried a slight continental accent that suggested sophisticated European education, and his knowledge of the latest developments in neurology and psychology seemed encyclopedic. The private clinic that Dr. Sinclair established on Princes Street, just a few blocks from Edinburgh Castle, quickly became one of the city's most exclusive medical facilities. The building itself, a 4-story Georgian townhouse that Sinclair had purchased and extensively renovated, projected an image of prosperous respectability. The ground floor featured elegant consultation rooms decorated with the finest furniture and medical texts, while the upper floors housed private treatment chambers for patients requiring extended care. What none of Sinclair's patients or colleagues knew was that the basement had been converted into something far more sinister than a simple storage area. Working in complete secrecy over the course of 2 years, Sinclair had constructed a laboratory that combined the precision of scientific research with the dark aesthetics of medieval alchemy. The centerpiece of this hidden facility was the memory extraction device, a machine so far ahead of its time that modern neuroscience would not develop comparable technology for more than a century. The device itself stood nearly 8 feet tall, constructed primarily of polished brass and copper with intricate gear mechanisms that suggested clockwork precision. Multiple leather restraint systems could secure a patient in various positions, while an array of thin copper needles could be positioned with mathematical accuracy against specific points on the human skull. Glass tubes filled with various colored liquids connected different components of the machine, creating a complex circulatory system that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. But the most remarkable feature of Sinclair's apparatus was the collection of glass orbs that lined the laboratory walls. Each sphere, roughly the size of a human head, contained what appeared to be luminescent gas that swirled and moved with patterns that seemed almost alive. These orbs were not merely storage containers, but active preservation systems that maintained the integrity of captured memories across extended periods of time. Dr. Sinclair's first successful experiment in memory extraction had been conducted on himself during the winter of 1878. Using a modified version of his device, he had carefully removed and stored his own recollections of a particularly traumatic childhood experience, then observed the effects of this selective amnesia over several months. The results exceeded his most optimistic expectations. Not only could he no longer recall the targeted memory, but the emotional distress associated with that experience had completely disappeared. More importantly, Sinclair discovered that the extracted memory had not been destroyed, but preserved in a state that allowed it to be studied, analyzed, and even experienced by someone else. By carefully adjusting the device's settings, he could review his own forgotten memory as if watching events unfold before his eyes. The implications were staggering. Human consciousness, Sinclair realized, was not an indivisible unity, but a collection of discrete experiences that could be separated, catalogued, and redistributed like books in a library. The first patient to undergo Sinclair's memory extraction procedure was Thomas Hartwell, a 42-year-old banker who had been suffering from severe melancholia following the death of his wife in a carriage accident. Hartwell had sought treatment from multiple physicians without relief, and his condition had deteriorated to the point where he was contemplating suicide. When conventional therapies failed, Hartwell's family brought him to Dr. Sinclair as a last resort. Sinclair's treatment of Thomas Hartwell represented a breakthrough in what he privately called psychic surgery. Rather than attempting to help the patient process his grief through conversation or medication, Sinclair proposed to simply remove the traumatic memories that were causing the emotional distress. The procedure, he explained to Hartwell's family, would involve the targeted extraction of specific recollections while leaving the patient's general personality and other memories intact. The extraction process required 3 separate sessions, each lasting approximately 4 hours. Hartwell was secured to the memory device using the leather restraints, and a series of thin copper needles were positioned against his skull according to Sinclair's carefully calculated measurements. The machine's gear mechanisms would then activate, creating what Sinclair described as controlled electrical stimulation of the brain's memory centers. The transformation in Thomas Hartwell was immediate and dramatic. After the final session, he emerged from the basement laboratory with no recollection of his wife's death or even of her existence. His melancholia had completely disappeared, replaced by a cheerful disposition that his family found both miraculous and deeply unsettling. Hartwell had been cured of his grief, but at the cost of losing all memory of the woman he had loved for 15 years. Dr. Sinclair, meanwhile, had gained access to Hartwell's extracted memories and found himself experiencing emotions and sensations that belonged to another person. He could recall Hartwell's wedding day with perfect clarity, feel the texture of his wife's hair, and experience the profound love that had existed between them. These borrowed memories felt as real and immediate as his own experiences, yet he retained complete awareness that they originated from someone else's life. The success of the Hartwell case established Dr. Sinclair's reputation as Edinburgh's leading specialist in memory disorders. Word of his miraculous treatment spread through the city's social networks, and wealthy families began bringing their most troubled relatives to his Princes Street clinic. Each case provided Sinclair with new opportunities to refine his techniques and expand his understanding of how human memory could be manipulated. Margaret Campbell's case represented the culmination of Dr. Sinclair's 3 years of experimentation with memory extraction. Unlike his previous patients, who had suffered from specific traumatic experiences, Margaret presented with what Sinclair classified as comprehensive memory dysfunction. She had been experiencing progressive memory loss that began with recent events and gradually extended backward into her childhood. Her family feared she was developing premature dementia, a condition that conventional medicine could neither explain nor treat. What made Margaret's case particularly interesting to Dr. Sinclair was not her symptoms, but the richness and complexity of her life experiences. As the wife of a successful Edinburgh merchant and mother of 3 children, she possessed decades of detailed memories spanning family relationships, social interactions, business dealings, and personal achievements. Her memories, Sinclair realized, represented a complete archive of middle-class Scottish life in the late 19th century. The extraction of Margaret Campbell's memories required the most sophisticated application of Sinclair's technology to date. Rather than targeting specific traumatic events, he attempted to perform what he called comprehensive consciousness harvesting. The procedure, conducted over 6 sessions spanning 2 weeks, involved the systematic removal of virtually all of Margaret's autobiographical memories while leaving her basic cognitive functions intact. The results exceeded even Sinclair's ambitious expectations. Margaret emerged from the treatment as a functional human being capable of speech, movement, and basic reasoning, but completely devoid of personal history. She could no longer recognize her own children, remember her husband's name, or recall any event from her previous life. She had been transformed into what Sinclair privately termed a clean slate, a human consciousness stripped of all experiential content. Dr. Sinclair, conversely, now possessed complete access to Margaret Campbell's extracted memories. He could experience her childhood in rural Scotland, recall her courtship and marriage, and feel the joy she had experienced at the birth of each of her children. These borrowed memories integrated seamlessly with his own consciousness, creating a dual identity that encompassed both his original personality and Margaret's complete life experience. The psychological effects of possessing another person's memories proved more complex than Sinclair had anticipated. While he retained intellectual awareness that these experiences belonged to Margaret Campbell, the emotional content felt entirely authentic. He found himself feeling maternal affection for children he had never met, experiencing romantic love for Margaret's husband, and carrying detailed knowledge of domestic routines he had never practiced. More disturbing still was Sinclair's growing realization that the extracted memories were not simply passive recordings, but contained active psychological elements that began influencing his behavior and decision-making. Margaret's memories came with their own emotional patterns, social preferences, and moral judgments that gradually began merging with his original personality. Sinclair was not merely storing borrowed experiences, he was becoming a composite being that incorporated elements of everyone whose memories he had extracted. The discovery of Dr. Sinclair's activities began with the investigation into Margaret Campbell's condition by her eldest son, James, who had become increasingly suspicious of his mother's dramatic personality change. James Campbell was a 28-year-old solicitor with sufficient education and resources to conduct his own inquiry into the treatment his mother had received. What he discovered challenged his understanding of both medical ethics and human nature. James Campbell's investigation began with a careful review of his mother's medical records and interviews with other patients who had received treatment from Dr. Sinclair. The pattern that emerged was deeply disturbing. Every patient who had undergone Sinclair's memory procedures showed similar symptoms: complete loss of specific memories, fundamental changes in personality, and an inability to recall the details of their treatment. Meanwhile, Dr. Sinclair himself seemed to possess intimate knowledge about his patients' forgotten experiences that no physician should have been able to acquire. The breakthrough in Campbell's investigation came when he convinced Dr. Blackthorne, his former professor at Edinburgh University, to examine his mother's condition using the latest techniques in neurological assessment. Blackthorne's examination revealed evidence of what he described as systematic cerebral intervention, suggesting that Margaret Campbell had been subjected to some form of direct manipulation of her brain tissue. Armed with this medical evidence, James Campbell obtained a court order authorizing a search of Dr. Sinclair's clinic on Princes Street. The search, conducted on August 15, 1881, would expose one of the most sophisticated and disturbing criminal enterprises in Scottish medical history. The search team, led by Inspector William Davidson of the Edinburgh Police, initially found nothing unusual in the upper floors of Sinclair's clinic. The consultation rooms, treatment chambers and medical library appeared to be exactly what they should be in a respectable physician's practice. However, when the investigators discovered the concealed entrance to the basement laboratory, they encountered evidence that challenged their understanding of medical science and human morality. The memory extraction device dominated the basement space like some monstrous altar dedicated to the worship of forbidden knowledge. Inspector Davidson, a practical man with little interest in scientific speculation, later wrote in his official report that the machine seemed to radiate an aura of malevolent intelligence, as if it possessed awareness of the crimes it had been used to commit. But it was the collection of 247 glowing orbs that provided the most compelling evidence of Dr. Sinclair's activities. Each sphere was carefully labeled with a patient's name, date of extraction, and detailed notes about the specific memories contained within. The orbs themselves seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm, and several members of the search team reported feeling dizzy and disoriented when they approached too closely. Dr. Blackthorne's examination of the memory device revealed a level of technological sophistication that seemed impossible for the 1880s. The machine incorporated principles of electrical stimulation, mechanical precision, and chemical preservation that would not be officially recognized by mainstream science for decades. Sinclair had somehow developed techniques for mapping and manipulating human memory that were far in advance of anything being researched at major universities. The most disturbing discovery came when investigators found Dr. Sinclair's detailed research journals, which documented 5 years of systematic experimentation on human subjects. The journals revealed that Sinclair had extracted memories from 247 different patients, each procedure carefully planned and executed with scientific precision. The extracted memories had been preserved in the glowing orbs and catalogued according to their emotional content, historical significance, and potential usefulness for future research. Sinclair's notes revealed that he had not limited himself to treating patients with genuine medical conditions. He had actively sought out individuals with particularly rich or interesting life experiences, sometimes advertising his services to wealthy families looking for ways to manage problematic relatives. Elderly patients with detailed memories of historical events, young women with romantic experiences, and successful businessmen with knowledge of commercial secrets had all become targets for Sinclair's memory harvesting operations. The psychological profile that emerged from Sinclair's writings portrayed a man who had gradually lost any sense of ethical boundaries in his pursuit of knowledge about human consciousness. He wrote about his patients not as people deserving of care and respect, but as sources of raw material for his research. Their memories, emotions, and life experiences were simply data to be collected, analyzed, and preserved for his own intellectual satisfaction. Perhaps most chilling of all was Sinclair's description of how the extracted memories had begun to influence his own personality and behavior. He wrote about experiencing identity confusion as borrowed memories merged with his original consciousness, creating a composite personality that incorporated elements from dozens of different people. Sinclair had become, in effect, a living repository of other people's experiences, but at the cost of his own authentic identity. The search for Dr. Malcolm Sinclair himself proved futile. When the investigators arrived at his clinic, they found evidence that he had departed Edinburgh several days earlier, taking with him portable versions of his research equipment and a selection of the most valuable memory orbs. His destination remained unknown, but shipping records suggested he had boarded a vessel bound for the Americas. The immediate aftermath of the discovery created a crisis for Edinburgh's medical establishment. Dr. Sinclair had been a respected member of the medical community, and several prominent physicians had referred patients to his clinic without suspecting the true nature of his treatments. The revelation that a sophisticated memory extraction operation had been conducted in the heart of Scotland's medical capital for 5 years without detection raised disturbing questions about professional oversight and ethical standards. The investigation into Dr. Malcolm Sinclair's memory extraction operations revealed a web of victims whose lives had been permanently altered by procedures they barely understood. Unlike conventional medical crimes, which typically resulted in physical harm or death, Sinclair's patients had been subjected to a form of violation that attacked the very essence of their identity. They remained alive and physically healthy, but had been robbed of the experiences and recollections that defined who they were as individuals. Dr. Oscar Blackthorne, leading the medical examination of Sinclair's former patients, documented the full scope of the damage in his comprehensive report to the Royal College of Physicians. The 247 individuals who had undergone memory extraction represented a cross-section of Edinburgh society, ranging from wealthy merchants and their families to middle-class professionals and working-class residents seeking treatment for various mental ailments. The case of Margaret Campbell, while the most thoroughly documented, was far from unique. Blackthorne's examination revealed that Sinclair had developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for targeting specific types of memories while leaving others intact. Some patients had lost only traumatic experiences, while others had been subjected to comprehensive extraction that removed virtually all autobiographical content from their minds. Thomas Hartwell, the banker whose treatment had established Sinclair's reputation, represented what Blackthorne classified as selective extraction. Hartwell retained his professional knowledge, social skills, and basic personality traits, but had completely lost all memories related to his deceased wife. The precision of the extraction was remarkable. Hartwell could remember events that had occurred on the same day as his wife's death, but the specific memories of the accident and everything connected to her had been completely removed. The psychological consequences of selective extraction proved complex and disturbing. While Hartwell no longer experienced the grief that had driven him to consider suicide, he had also lost the capacity for the deep emotional connections that had previously defined his character. His family described him as pleasant but strangely hollow, as if some essential part of his humanity had been removed along with the targeted memories. Eleanor Whitmore, a 28-year-old woman from one of Edinburgh's most prominent families, had undergone what Sinclair termed personality modification extraction. Eleanor had been brought to the clinic by her parents, who were concerned about her increasingly rebellious behavior and her romantic involvement with a man they considered socially inappropriate. Sinclair had promised to remove the memories and emotional attachments that were causing Eleanor to reject her family's expectations. The extraction procedure had targeted Eleanor's memories of her romantic relationship, her experiences with literature and philosophy that had encouraged independent thinking, and specific recollections of conflicts with her parents. What remained was a docile, compliant woman who showed no interest in books, no curiosity about ideas, and no inclination to challenge authority. Eleanor's family initially celebrated the transformation, but gradually came to realize that they had effectively murdered their daughter's original personality. Blackthorne's examination of Eleanor revealed that the extraction had been so comprehensive that she could no longer access the emotional and intellectual resources necessary for authentic human relationships. She could perform social interactions according to learned patterns, but showed no genuine engagement with other people. Her parents had obtained the compliant daughter they wanted, but at the cost of Eleanor's capacity for independent thought and emotional depth. The case of William Morrison, a 45-year-old historian and professor at Edinburgh University, demonstrated Sinclair's most ambitious application of memory extraction technology. Morrison had been suffering from what he described as overwhelming memories of traumatic historical events he had researched throughout his career. The weight of knowledge about human suffering and historical atrocities had driven him to seek treatment for what would now be recognized as secondary trauma from his scholarly work. Sinclair had proposed to extract Morrison's academic memories while preserving his personal recollections, essentially separating his professional knowledge from his emotional response to that knowledge. The procedure required 12 separate sessions over the course of 3 months, making it one of the most complex extractions Sinclair had ever attempted. The results were catastrophic for Morrison's intellectual capacity. While he retained basic cognitive functions and personal memories, he had lost access to virtually all of his historical knowledge. The man who had been considered one of Scotland's leading experts on medieval European history could no longer remember basic historical facts or access the research methods that had defined his career. Morrison's colleagues described him as intellectually diminished, capable of simple conversations, but unable to engage with complex ideas or abstract concepts. Dr. Sinclair, meanwhile, had gained access to Morrison's extensive historical knowledge and found himself possessing detailed information about events spanning centuries of European history. Sinclair's research notes revealed his fascination with experiencing these borrowed academic memories, which allowed him to understand historical events with the depth and nuance that only decades of specialized study could provide. The extraction of Morrison's memories raised disturbing questions about the nature of intellectual property and the relationship between knowledge and identity. Morrison's expertise had been accumulated through years of research and study, yet Sinclair had been able to acquire this knowledge instantaneously through memory extraction. The ethical implications were staggering. Sinclair had essentially stolen Morrison's life's work and left him intellectually impoverished. Catherine Mackenzie, a 19-year-old woman from a working-class Edinburgh family, represented one of Sinclair's most controversial cases. Catherine had been experiencing what her family described as prophetic visions and supernatural communications, symptoms that contemporary medicine would likely classify as early-stage schizophrenia. Her parents had brought her to Sinclair hoping that he could remove the disturbing memories and experiences that seemed to be driving her toward complete mental breakdown. Sinclair's treatment of Catherine involved the extraction of all memories related to her supposed supernatural experiences, along with the emotional and perceptual patterns that had made her susceptible to hallucinations. The procedure succeeded in eliminating Catherine's psychological symptoms, but also removed much of her creative and intuitive capacity. The young woman, who had once produced remarkable poetry and demonstrated unusual artistic talent, emerged from treatment as a conventional, unremarkable individual with no particular gifts or interests. The loss of Catherine's visionary experiences might have been considered a therapeutic success, but Dr. Blackthorne's examination revealed disturbing evidence that her extracted memories contained genuine insights that defied rational explanation. Catherine's visions had included detailed knowledge about people and events that she could not have acquired through normal means, suggesting that her psychological condition might have involved actual extrasensory perception rather than simple mental illness. Dr. Sinclair's research notes revealed his fascination with Catherine's extracted memories, which he described as providing access to forms of perception that extended beyond normal human sensory capacity. Sinclair claimed that by experiencing Catherine's memories, he had gained the ability to perceive auras around other people, to sense emotional states without verbal cues, and to occasionally glimpse future events. The scientific implications were extraordinary, but the cost to Catherine had been the complete loss of her unique psychological gifts. The case of James Rutherford, a 52-year-old successful Edinburgh merchant, demonstrated Sinclair's willingness to exploit patients for purely commercial purposes. Rutherford had sought treatment for mild depression following a series of business setbacks, but Sinclair had identified him as a valuable source of commercial knowledge and business memories. Rather than limiting the extraction to Rutherford's negative emotional experiences, Sinclair had systematically harvested his knowledge of trade relationships, financial strategies, and commercial secrets. Rutherford emerged from treatment not only free of depression, but completely unable to recall the business expertise that had made him successful. He could no longer remember the names of his trading partners, the details of financial agreements, or the strategic thinking that had built his commercial empire. Within months of his treatment, Rutherford's business had collapsed as he proved incapable of making the complex decisions that commerce required. Dr. Sinclair, conversely, had gained access to decades of commercial experience and business knowledge. His research notes revealed that he had used Rutherford's extracted memories to make successful investments and establish profitable trading relationships. Sinclair had essentially stolen not just memories, but the economic foundation of Rutherford's life, leaving his patient impoverished while enriching himself with borrowed expertise. The systematic nature of Sinclair's memory extraction operations became clear as investigators analyzed the complete collection of preserved memories. The 247 glowing orbs represented a comprehensive archive of human experience, carefully categorized according to their contents and potential value. Sinclair had created what amounted to a library of stolen consciousness, with each orb containing the extracted essence of an individual life. The organizational system Sinclair had developed revealed the scope of his ambitions. Memories were classified by emotional content, with separate collections for love, grief, fear, joy, and anger. Professional knowledge was categorized by field, with orbs containing medical expertise, legal knowledge, business acumen, and artistic skills. Personal experiences were sorted by significance, with collections focusing on childhood memories, romantic relationships, family connections, and traumatic events. Perhaps most disturbing was Sinclair's collection of what he termed exotic memories, experiences that fell outside normal human categories. These orbs contained the recollections of individuals who had experienced unusual psychological states, supernatural encounters, or extreme physical and emotional conditions. Sinclair had systematically sought out patients with unique or remarkable experiences, extracting their memories not for therapeutic purposes, but to satisfy his own curiosity about the outer boundaries of human consciousness. The investigation revealed that Sinclair had developed a sophisticated network for identifying potential victims with valuable memories. He had cultivated relationships with other physicians who would refer patients with interesting psychological conditions. He had advertised his services to wealthy families looking for solutions to problematic relatives. He had even recruited agents who would identify individuals with remarkable life experiences and encourage them to seek treatment at his clinic. The targeting of victims followed patterns that revealed Sinclair's psychological profile and research interests. He showed particular interest in individuals with strong emotional experiences, extensive professional knowledge, or unusual perceptual abilities. Women were disproportionately represented among his victims, possibly because Sinclair found female emotional experiences particularly fascinating, or because women were more easily convinced to undergo experimental treatments. Age patterns among the victims suggested that Sinclair preferred patients between 25 and 50 years old, individuals who had accumulated substantial life experience but were still mentally sharp enough to provide high-quality memories. Elderly patients were avoided because their memories might be degraded, while younger patients lacked the experiential depth that Sinclair valued. The social class distribution of victims revealed Sinclair's understanding of Edinburgh's power structures. While he extracted memories from patients across the economic spectrum, his most comprehensive procedures were performed on individuals with sufficient social standing to provide valuable knowledge, but insufficient power to investigate his activities effectively. Working-class patients provided emotional and sensory experiences, while middle-class victims contributed professional knowledge and social skills. Dr. Blackthorne's medical examination of the victims revealed long-term consequences that extended far beyond the immediate loss of specific memories. Many patients showed signs of what he termed existential disorientation, a fundamental confusion about their own identity and place in the world. Without access to the memories that had shaped their personality development, these individuals struggled to maintain consistent behavior patterns or form meaningful relationships. The concept of informed consent, already poorly developed in 1880s medicine, had been completely absent from Sinclair's procedures. Patients had been told they were receiving treatment for their psychological conditions, but none had been informed about the true nature of memory extraction or its permanent consequences. Many had undergone multiple procedures without understanding that each session would result in further loss of their personal history. The families of victims faced their own unique trauma as they watched loved ones transform into strangers who retained familiar faces but had lost the memories and personality traits that defined their relationships. Parents could no longer connect with children who had forgotten shared experiences. Spouses found themselves married to individuals who had no recollection of their courtship, wedding, or years of shared life. The social fabric of families and communities had been torn apart by Sinclair's manipulation of human memory. The legal implications of Sinclair's crimes challenged existing frameworks for understanding medical malpractice and assault. Traditional law focused on physical harm and property damage, but Sinclair's victims had been robbed of something far more fundamental than material possessions. They had lost their personal history, their accumulated wisdom, and their authentic identity. Legal scholars struggled to develop appropriate charges and penalties for crimes that had no precedent in judicial history. The medical community's response to the revelations about Sinclair's activities revealed deep divisions about the ethics of experimental procedures and the boundaries of therapeutic intervention. Some physicians argued that memory extraction could be a valuable treatment for severe psychological trauma if properly regulated and applied with appropriate consent. Others maintained that any manipulation of human memory represented a fundamental violation of personal dignity and should be banned entirely. The discovery of Dr. Malcolm Sinclair's memory extraction operations sent shockwaves through the international medical community that would continue to reverberate for decades. The sophistication of his technology, the systematic nature of his crimes, and the philosophical questions raised by his research challenged fundamental assumptions about medical ethics, human consciousness, and the nature of personal identity. The case became a watershed moment in the development of modern medical regulation and established precedents that would influence approaches to experimental procedures well into the 20th century. Dr. Oscar Blackthorne's comprehensive investigation, published as a 400-page report by the Royal College of Physicians in 1882, provided the medical community with its first detailed analysis of systematic memory manipulation and its consequences for human psychology. The report, initially classified as too disturbing for general circulation, was eventually recognized as a foundational document in the emerging field of neuropsychology and remains studied by researchers examining the relationship between memory and identity. The immediate response to Blackthorne's findings was a crisis of confidence within Edinburgh's medical establishment. The Royal College of Physicians launched a comprehensive review of all experimental procedures being conducted by its members, leading to the discovery of several other questionable research projects that, while not approaching the scope of Sinclair's activities, revealed a disturbing pattern of inadequate oversight and ethical lapses. The investigation revealed that Sinclair's work had not been conducted in complete isolation. Several prominent Edinburgh physicians had been aware of his research into memory manipulation, and some had even provided theoretical support for his investigations. Dr. Alexander Cameron, a respected neurologist and former colleague of Sinclair's at the University of Vienna, had contributed to the theoretical framework underlying the memory extraction procedures through a series of published papers on the localization of memory functions in the brain. Cameron's involvement raised uncomfortable questions about the complicity of the broader medical community in Sinclair's crimes. While Cameron claimed he had been unaware of the practical applications of his theoretical work, his publications had provided the scientific justification for targeted memory extraction. The case highlighted the potential dangers of theoretical research when applied by individuals without appropriate ethical constraints. The international implications of the Sinclair case became apparent as investigators traced his connections to research institutions across Europe and America. Correspondence found in Sinclair's laboratory revealed that he had been part of an informal network of physicians and researchers investigating the manipulation of human consciousness through various experimental methods. Several European universities had been receiving regular reports from Sinclair about his progress in memory extraction, and some had provided funding for his research. The University of Vienna, where Sinclair had received his training, launched its own investigation into the theoretical foundations of memory manipulation research. The inquiry revealed that Sinclair had been part of a small group of graduate students who had developed an interest in the potential for direct intervention in brain function. While most of his colleagues had limited their research to animal subjects and theoretical speculation, Sinclair had apparently decided to pursue human experimentation without institutional oversight or ethical approval. The Vienna investigation led to a broader examination of experimental psychology and neurology programs across Europe. Several institutions discovered that their faculty members had been conducting research into memory manipulation, consciousness transfer, and related phenomena. While none had achieved the sophistication of Sinclair's operation, the pattern of investigation suggested a widespread interest in the potential for direct manipulation of human consciousness. The American response to the Sinclair case was particularly significant because of evidence that he might have fled to the United States after the discovery of his Edinburgh operations. The newly formed American Medical Association launched an investigation into reports of mysterious memory disorders appearing in patients who had received treatment from European physicians working in major American cities. Dr. William Thompson of Johns Hopkins University, who led the American investigation, discovered evidence of at least 3 physicians in the United States who possessed technology similar to Sinclair's memory extraction device. While none of these practitioners had operated on the scale of Sinclair's Edinburgh clinic, their activities suggested that knowledge of memory manipulation techniques had spread to the Americas along with European immigration. The Thompson investigation led to the development of the first formal protocols for investigating suspected cases of memory manipulation. These procedures, initially designed for the Sinclair case, would later be adapted for investigating various forms of psychological abuse and experimental medical procedures. The protocols established standards for documenting memory loss, identifying technological evidence of memory extraction, and providing appropriate care for victims of consciousness manipulation. The search for Dr. Malcolm Sinclair himself continued for more than a decade after his disappearance from Edinburgh. Interpol, established partly in response to the international nature of crimes like Sinclair's, coordinated investigations across multiple countries and eventually accumulated evidence suggesting that Sinclair had established new operations in at least 3 different locations. The most credible sighting occurred in 1887 in Buenos Aires, where Argentine authorities investigated reports of a European physician who was treating wealthy families for various psychological conditions. The physician, who used the name Dr. Marcus Sinclair, possessed advanced medical equipment and specialized in memory-related disorders. When authorities attempted to investigate the clinic, they found it abandoned, with evidence suggesting a hasty departure similar to the pattern established in Edinburgh. Additional reports placed Sinclair in New York City in 1890, where several prominent families reported mysterious personality changes in relatives who had received treatment from a physician specializing in nervous disorders. The New York investigation revealed evidence of memory extraction technology, but the suspected practitioner had disappeared before he could be apprehended. The final confirmed sighting of Dr. Malcolm Sinclair occurred in 1893 in San Francisco, where he had apparently established the most sophisticated memory extraction operation since his Edinburgh clinic. The San Francisco facility was discovered after a prominent businessman's daughter underwent a dramatic personality change following treatment for mild depression. The investigation revealed a fully equipped laboratory containing an advanced version of Sinclair's memory extraction device and a collection of more than 400 preserved memory orbs. The San Francisco laboratory represented the culmination of Sinclair's research and development efforts during his 12 years as a fugitive. The memory extraction device had been refined and improved, incorporating new technologies that allowed for even more precise targeting of specific memories and more effective preservation of extracted consciousness. The collection of memory orbs included specimens from patients treated in Edinburgh, Buenos Aires, New York, and San Francisco, creating what amounted to an international archive of stolen human experience. Sinclair himself was found dead in the San Francisco laboratory, apparently having died several weeks before the facility was discovered. The circumstances of his death remain mysterious, but evidence suggests he may have been conducting memory extraction procedures on himself at the time of his death. His body was found connected to the extraction device, and several memory orbs near his workstation contained what appeared to be his own preserved consciousness. The discovery of Sinclair's final laboratory provided investigators with unprecedented access to his complete research records and the most advanced memory extraction technology ever developed. The scientific implications were extraordinary, but the ethical questions raised by his work continued to challenge the medical community's understanding of appropriate research boundaries. Dr. Thompson's analysis of the San Francisco materials revealed that Sinclair had made significant advances in memory manipulation during his years as a fugitive. He had developed techniques for selective memory modification that could alter specific recollections without affecting surrounding experiences. He had created methods for transferring memories between individuals, essentially allowing personality traits and knowledge to be shared or redistributed. Most remarkably, he had achieved partial success in preserving complete human consciousness in a form that could potentially be transferred to a new biological host. The implications of Sinclair's final research were so profound that the international medical community agreed to classify the findings and restrict access to the most sensitive materials. The complete records of his memory manipulation techniques were sealed in a secure archive, accessible only to researchers who could demonstrate legitimate scientific purposes and appropriate ethical oversight. The technological legacy of Sinclair's work proved more durable than anticipated. Several of the physicians who had been part of his international network continued developing memory manipulation techniques using theoretical principles derived from his research. While none achieved the sophistication of Sinclair's original work, they contributed to a growing body of knowledge about the relationship between brain function and consciousness that would eventually influence the development of modern neuroscience. The ethical legacy of the Sinclair case had immediate and lasting effects on medical practice and research regulation. The Royal College of Physicians established the first formal committee for medical ethics in 1883, charged specifically with developing guidelines for experimental procedures involving human subjects. The committee's initial recommendations, heavily influenced by the Sinclair case, established principles of informed consent, institutional oversight, and patient protection that would become standard practice in medical research. The concept of informed consent, previously considered unnecessary for routine medical procedures, became a central requirement for any experimental treatment following the Sinclair revelations. Patients had to be provided with detailed information about the nature, risks, and potential consequences of any procedure before they could legally consent to treatment. The standard was particularly stringent for procedures involving the brain or nervous system, reflecting the medical community's recognition that consciousness and memory represented fundamental aspects of human identity that required special protection. Institutional oversight mechanisms were strengthened significantly in response to evidence that Sinclair had operated without adequate supervision from his professional colleagues. Medical schools and hospitals were required to establish review boards that would evaluate all experimental procedures before they could be implemented. These boards, composed of physicians, scientists, and community representatives, were given authority to approve, modify, or reject research proposals based on ethical considerations as well as scientific merit. The patient protection standards developed in response to the Sinclair case established the principle that the welfare of individual patients must take precedence over potential scientific advancement. Researchers were prohibited from conducting procedures that could cause permanent harm to participants, regardless of the potential benefits to medical knowledge. The standards specifically addressed memory manipulation, declaring that any procedure designed to alter, extract, or transfer human memories would be considered a fundamental violation of personal dignity and identity. The legal consequences of the Sinclair case extended far beyond medical regulation, influencing the development of criminal law and establishing new categories of crime that addressed violations of psychological integrity. The concept of memory theft was formally recognized as a distinct criminal offense, punishable by penalties comparable to those for murder or permanent physical disability. The logic was that stealing a person's memories constituted an attack on their fundamental identity that could be considered equivalent to destroying their authentic self. International cooperation in criminal investigation was significantly enhanced by the Sinclair case, as authorities recognized that crimes involving advanced technology and specialized knowledge could easily cross national boundaries. The protocols developed for tracking Sinclair and his associates became models for investigating other forms of international crime, contributing to the development of more sophisticated law enforcement cooperation mechanisms. The philosophical implications of Sinclair's research continued to influence academic discourse long after his death. The demonstration that memories could be extracted, stored, and transferred raised fundamental questions about the nature of personal identity and the relationship between consciousness and physical brain function. Philosophers and theologians engaged in extensive debates about whether identity resided in memories, physical continuity, or some combination of factors that Sinclair's work had not addressed. The question of whether extracted memories retained some form of consciousness became a subject of intense speculation and limited investigation. Several researchers reported unusual phenomena when studying Sinclair's preserved memory orbs, including apparent responses to external stimuli and patterns of activity that suggested some form of ongoing mental process. However, the ethical constraints established in response to Sinclair's crimes prevented detailed investigation of these phenomena. Religious communities struggled to incorporate the implications of memory extraction into their theological frameworks. The possibility that human consciousness could be separated from the physical body challenged traditional concepts of the soul and raised disturbing questions about the nature of afterlife and spiritual identity. Several denominations issued official statements declaring memory extraction to be incompatible with divine design and prohibiting their members from participating in related research. The medical community's long-term response to the Sinclair case involved a careful balance between maintaining ethical standards and pursuing legitimate research into memory, consciousness, and brain function. Theoretical work continued within appropriate ethical constraints, leading to significant advances in understanding the neurological basis of memory formation and retrieval. However, direct manipulation of human memory remained prohibited, ensuring that the practical applications of Sinclair's discoveries would never be fully explored. Educational institutions incorporated the Sinclair case into their curricula as a cautionary example of the potential consequences of unrestrained scientific ambition. Medical schools required students to study the case as part of their training in professional ethics, emphasizing the responsibility of physicians to protect patient welfare above all other considerations. The case became a standard reference point for discussions about the appropriate boundaries of medical research and the importance of institutional oversight. The victims of Sinclair's experiments received varying degrees of support and compensation from medical institutions and government agencies. While their lost memories could never be restored, efforts were made to provide psychological counseling, financial assistance, and social support to help them rebuild their lives. Some victims developed coping strategies that allowed them to function effectively despite their memory loss, while others remained permanently disabled by the psychological consequences of their experiences. Margaret Campbell, whose case had been most thoroughly documented, became an advocate for victims of medical experimentation and contributed to the development of patient protection standards. Despite her inability to remember her previous life, she demonstrated remarkable resilience in building a new identity and establishing meaningful relationships. Her later writings about the experience of living without autobiographical memory provided valuable insights into the relationship between memory and identity. The families of Sinclair's victims faced their own long-term challenges as they attempted to maintain relationships with individuals who could no longer remember shared experiences. Support groups were established to help family members cope with the grief of losing loved ones who remained physically present but psychologically transformed. These groups contributed to a better understanding of the social and emotional consequences of memory loss and influenced the development of support services for families affected by various forms of cognitive impairment. The scientific legacy of Sinclair's work proved both valuable and dangerous. The theoretical principles underlying memory extraction contributed to legitimate advances in neuroscience and psychology, but the practical techniques he had developed were considered too dangerous for further exploration. The tension between scientific curiosity and ethical responsibility became a defining characteristic of memory research for generations following the case. Several researchers attempted to develop ethical approaches to memory manipulation that could provide therapeutic benefits without the risks associated with Sinclair's methods. These efforts focused on temporary, reversible interventions that could help patients process traumatic experiences without permanently altering their memories. However, progress was slow due to the strict ethical constraints established in response to Sinclair's crimes. The preservation of Sinclair's research materials created ongoing dilemmas for the scientific community. The complete records of his procedures represented invaluable scientific data that could contribute to understanding of human consciousness and memory function. However, the ethical problems associated with the research made it difficult to justify studying the materials, even for legitimate scientific purposes. The materials remained sealed in secure archives, accessible only under extraordinary circumstances and with extensive ethical oversight. The international nature of Sinclair's crimes highlighted the need for global coordination in addressing emerging forms of scientific and medical crime. The protocols developed for investigating his activities became models for international cooperation in addressing other forms of technology-based criminal activity. The case contributed to the development of international legal frameworks for addressing crimes that transcended national boundaries and required specialized expertise to investigate and prosecute. The cultural impact of the Sinclair case extended beyond medical and legal institutions, influencing literature, philosophy, and popular understanding of the relationship between memory and identity. Writers and artists drew inspiration from the case to explore themes of psychological violation, the nature of authenticity, and the consequences of scientific overreach. The case became a reference point for cultural discussions about the appropriate limits of technological intervention in human experience. The long-term consequences of memory extraction for Sinclair's victims provided ongoing evidence of the fundamental importance of autobiographical memory for psychological health and social functioning. Follow-up studies conducted decades after the original procedures revealed that victims continued to experience identity confusion, relationship difficulties, and existential uncertainty throughout their lives. The research contributed to a better understanding of the role memory plays in maintaining psychological continuity and personal identity. The question of whether Sinclair's techniques could be used for beneficial purposes continued to generate debate within the medical community. Some argued that carefully regulated memory modification could provide relief for patients suffering from severe trauma or debilitating psychological conditions. Others maintained that any manipulation of human memory represented an unacceptable violation of personal dignity, regardless of potential therapeutic benefits. The preservation of Sinclair's consciousness in the memory orbs found at his final laboratory raised unprecedented questions about the nature of death and the possibility of technological immortality. Several researchers reported evidence suggesting that the orbs containing Sinclair's memories showed patterns of activity consistent with ongoing consciousness, but ethical constraints prevented detailed investigation of these phenomena. The possibility that human consciousness could survive bodily death in technological form challenged fundamental assumptions about mortality and the nature of human existence. The ultimate fate of Dr. Malcolm Sinclair remains one of history's most disturbing mysteries. While his physical body was found in the San Francisco laboratory, the presence of his preserved consciousness in multiple memory orbs raised questions about whether he had achieved some form of technological survival. Reports of unusual phenomena associated with the orbs, including apparent responses to external stimuli and evidence of continued mental activity, suggested that Sinclair might have succeeded in preserving his consciousness beyond biological death. The sealed archives containing Sinclair's research materials became the subject of ongoing controversy as advances in neuroscience and technology made his discoveries increasingly relevant to legitimate medical research. Periodic requests for access to the materials were carefully evaluated by international review committees, but the ethical implications of studying research obtained through systematic human rights violations continued to prevent detailed investigation of Sinclair's findings. The Sinclair case established precedents that would influence medical ethics and research regulation well into the modern era. The principles of informed consent, institutional oversight, and patient protection developed in response to his crimes became foundational elements of contemporary medical practice. The case served as a permanent reminder of the potential consequences of unrestrained scientific ambition and the importance of maintaining ethical boundaries in medical research. The mystery of the memory thief of Edinburgh remains one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of medical science. Dr. Malcolm Sinclair's systematic extraction and theft of human memories challenged fundamental assumptions about identity, consciousness, and the appropriate limits of medical intervention. His legacy continues to influence debates about medical ethics, the nature of human consciousness, and the responsibilities of scientific researchers to protect the dignity and welfare of human subjects. The 247 glowing orbs discovered in Sinclair's laboratory represented more than just stolen memories. They embodied the systematic violation of human dignity and the transformation of individual consciousness into objects of scientific curiosity. Each orb contained the extracted essence of a human life, preserved for purposes that served Sinclair's ambitions rather than the welfare of his patients. The victims of his procedures lost not just specific memories, but fundamental aspects of their identity and humanity. The case of the memory thief serves as a permanent warning about the potential dangers of scientific research conducted without appropriate ethical constraints and institutional oversight. It demonstrates how individual ambition and intellectual curiosity, when divorced from moral responsibility and human compassion, can lead to systematic abuse and the violation of the most fundamental aspects of human dignity. The lessons learned from Dr. Malcolm Sinclair's crimes continue to influence medical practice and research ethics, ensuring that the rights and welfare of patients remain paramount in all medical endeavors.